What kind of king would look into the eyes of his starving subjects and force them to commit the ultimate taboo? For King Herod, legend says it wasn't enough to kill his enemies. He made his people devour their own children. The truth? Far darker than the myth. In the heart of ancient Judea, under the reign of a king so brutal he would become a monster, a cry of despair echoed through the barren lands. It was a sound that signaled the absolute end of humanity, a moment when the sacred bonds of family were not just broken, but devoured by an unimaginable choice, a choice between starvation and a horror that would stain their history forever. This is the story of how a society was pushed past the brink, and how parents were forced to eat their own children to survive. What you are about to witness is a journey into one of history's most terrifying chapters. We'll explore the reign of a ruler consumed by a paranoia that twisted him into a monster. We'll face the chilling reality of famine in the ancient world, and we'll confront the ultimate taboo, the one that becomes a desperate necessity when a city is starved into submission. This story is brutal. It's horrifying, but it reveals a profound and disturbing truth about what we are capable of when civilization is stripped away, and only the raw will to live remains. Now, it's here that the story takes a twisted turn. The most graphic, detailed accounts of famine-induced cannibalism in Judea come from a period slightly after the reign of the king we're focusing on. But the king in question, the infamous Herod the Great, created a kingdom of such terror and instability that he loaded the gun for the horrors to come. His reign is the perfect, blood-soaked lens through which to understand the conditions that can push a society to the absolute breaking point. So while this specific, horrific act may not have been recorded under his watch, you cannot understand the desperation that followed without first understanding the Mad King who set the stage. To understand how a people could be driven to this, you first have to understand the man who broke them. King Herod, known to history as Herod the Great, was not born a king of Judea. He was an outsider, an Idumean, installed by the Roman Senate to be their puppet, a client king meant to keep the peace and ensure Judea's loyalty to Rome. From the moment he took the throne, many of his Jewish subjects saw him for what he was, a usurper propped up by a foreign empire. This deep-seated insecurity festered inside him, metastasizing into a paranoia that would define his 33-year reign and stain his hands with the blood of his rivals, his people, and his own family. Herod was a man of staggering, terrifying contradictions. On one hand, he was a builder of genius, a visionary whose architectural projects were wonders of the ancient world. He transformed Jerusalem, expanding the Temple Mount into a breathtaking spectacle. He raised the port city of Caesarea Maritima from the sand, built the impenetrable fortress of Masada, and the palace fortress of Herodium. These weren't just monuments to his ego, they were massive public works that employed thousands, projecting an image of immense strength and stability. But beneath that veneer of stone and marble was a mind rotting with suspicion. Herod saw conspiracies in every shadow and assassins in his own hallways. His court was a viper's nest of plotting and intrigue, and his response was always the same: swift, merciless, and bloody. He established a secret police to hunt down and crush any hint of dissent. He levied crushing taxes on his people to fund his lavish buildings and his powerful army. His paranoia wasn't just political, it was personal, intimate. He lived in constant, gnawing fear of being overthrown by the Hasmoneans, the true Jewish royal dynasty he had violently displaced. This fear drove him to commit acts of unspeakable cruelty. He had his own wife, Miriam, a Hasmonean princess he was said to be obsessively in love with, executed on suspicion of a plot. But he didn't stop there. Over the years, he ordered the executions of her grandfather, her mother, and eventually, the two sons he had with her, Alexander and Aristobulus. As he neared the end of his own life, riddled with disease, he had his eldest son, Antipater, killed as well, just 5 days before his own death. The Roman Emperor Augustus, hearing that Herod had murdered his own children, is said to have remarked with grim irony, "It is better to be Herod's hog than his son," a dark pun on the Greek words for hog and son, and a nod to the Jewish prohibition against eating pork. Herod's paranoia reached its terrifying peak in the event for which he is most infamous, the biblical account of the Massacre of the Innocents. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that when Herod heard from the Magi of the birth of a new king of the Jews in Bethlehem, he gave a chilling order: execute all male children 2 years old and under in the entire town and its vicinity. While other historians of the period, like Josephus, don't record this event, it is terrifyingly consistent with the man's character. The true scale was likely smaller than legend claims, perhaps a dozen or two infants in a small town like Bethlehem. But the intent is what freezes the blood. For a man who would murder his own sons to protect his crown, slaughtering a handful of babies in a backwater village would have been nothing. But Josephus does record another incident that perfectly captures Herod's monstrous ego. As he lay on his deathbed, consumed by a painful and foul disease, he was tormented by one thought. His subjects hated him and would celebrate his death. To ensure his passing would be a day of national mourning, he commanded that the most distinguished men from across Judea be arrested, brought to Jericho, and locked inside the hippodrome. He then gave his sister, Salome, a final, horrifying command. The moment he drew his last breath, her soldiers were to massacre every single prisoner. This way, he reasoned, there would be genuine grief throughout the land, even if it wasn't for him. The order was never carried out, but the plan itself gives us a terrifying glimpse into the mind of a king who had become a monster. This was the kind of rule that grinds a people down, a reign of terror that laid the foundation for the calamities to come. To truly grasp the horror that awaits, we have to step away from the blood-soaked palace and understand the brutal, daily reality for ordinary people. For them, the most feared enemy wasn't always a king or an army. It was something far more elemental, an invisible specter that could creep into any town, any city, and bring an entire civilization to its knees. Famine. Today, for many of us, food is a given. But in the ancient world, survival was a razor's edge, a year-to-year battle against extinction. Societies were almost entirely agrarian, their very existence hanging on the whims of the sun and the rain. A single failed harvest could spell disaster. A drought that dragged on, like the 7 lean years from the book of Genesis, was a death sentence for thousands. A flash flood could erase a year's crops in hours. A plague of locusts could descend like a living storm and devour a generation's labor in a single, terrifying day. When food grew scarce, the very fabric of society began to tear apart at the seams. The first sign was always the price of grain. It would skyrocket, pushing a simple loaf of bread beyond the reach of the poor. People would sell their tools, then their land, then their homes, anything for just a few more mouthfuls of food. They would turn to what one chronicler called unclean foods. People were seen eating bitter weeds, fried withered grapes, and scavenging for vegetable stalks from filthy gutters. They would eat leather, gnaw on straw, and hunt animals that were normally considered vermin. As the weeks bled into months, the physical toll became a walking horror show. Starvation isn't a peaceful death. The body, denied energy, begins to consume itself. First, it burns through fat. Then, it devours muscle. The body withers, the skin hangs from the bones like a loose shroud, and the stomach bloats grotesquely. The immune system collapses, leaving the population helpless against diseases like dysentery and typhus, which would sweep through the weakened masses like wildfire. Your mind begins to betray you, consumed by one single, screaming thought: food. This gnawing, relentless hunger erodes more than just the body. It erodes the soul. Social bonds, religious laws, moral codes. These are luxuries a starving person cannot afford. Neighbors stole from neighbors. Families turn on each other. The old and the sick, once cared for, were now just mouths to feed, drains on a dwindling supply. Desperation drove people to abandon everything, becoming refugees in their own land, only to find the specter of famine was waiting for them there, too. The Bible itself is filled with warnings of famine, seen as one of the most terrible curses God could inflict on his people. In the book of Deuteronomy, a chilling prophecy hangs over them, a warning of what would happen if they broke their covenant. You will eat the fruit of your womb, the flesh of your sons and daughters, in the siege and distress with which your enemies will afflict you. For the people of ancient Judea, this wasn't just literature. It was a real, deeply ingrained fear. The fear of a hunger so absolute it could force a parent to break the most sacred taboo of all. This prophecy, this curse, would linger in the back of their minds, a terrifying possibility waiting for the right moment of despair and destruction to become a grim reality. The fear of famine was a constant, simmering anxiety. But there was one scenario that could turn that fear into an absolute certainty, a tactic of war designed to weaponize hunger and turn a bustling city into a sealed tomb: the siege. Siege warfare was a brutal, ugly, and terrifyingly effective strategy. For a powerful, walled city like Jerusalem, a direct assault was a bloody, costly gamble. It was often far easier, and infinitely more cruel, to simply surround the city and wait. An army would encamp around the walls, building fortifications not to break in, but to ensure that no one and nothing could get out. They would sever the arteries of the city. No more caravans bringing grain from the countryside. No more farmers smuggling in vegetables. No more shepherds driving their flocks to the city gates. The city was now an island, completely cut off from the world, with only the food stored within its walls to keep its people alive. At first, life inside might not change much. The authorities would open the granaries and begin rationing. But as the days turned into weeks, the terrifying reality of their situation would begin to sink in. The poor would be the first to suffer, their meager reserves gone in an instant. The price of food wouldn't just rise, it would become astronomical. The Bible, describing the siege of Samaria, gives a shocking example. A single donkey's head, from an animal considered unclean, was sold for 80 shekels of silver. A tiny pouch of dove's dung, likely a common, cheap seed pod, sold for 5 shekels, a fortune for a family slowly starving to death. The city would begin to eat itself. Every stray dog, every cat, every rat would be hunted down and consumed. People would boil leather sandals and belts for hours to create a gelatinous, barely nourishing broth. The familiar smell of wood smoke from cooking fires would vanish, replaced by an eerie silence, because there was nothing left to cook. And then, the sounds of the city would change. The laughter of children playing in the streets would fade, replaced by a constant, low wail of hunger. The bustling markets would fall silent. The only sounds left would be the cries of the starving and the steady, patient presence of the enemy army outside the walls, an army that didn't need to fight, because time and hunger were their greatest weapons. This was psychological warfare. The besieging army knew that inside those walls, society was collapsing. They knew that loyalties were cracking, that desperation was breeding dissent. They knew that every single sunrise brought the defenders one day closer to an impossible choice: surrender, starve, or do the unthinkable. While we lack a specific record of this happening under Herod himself, this was the terrifying reality of war in his time. The people of Judea knew the grim mathematics of a siege. Every day, the number of mouths stayed the same, but the supply of food dwindled. The city was no longer a home. It had become a cage, and the people trapped inside were being slowly, inexorably starved into submission, bringing them ever closer to the brink of that terrible, ancient curse. There is a line that separates civilization from savagery, humanity from the most primal, desperate animal. For the people trapped inside a dying city, that line is crossed when the last grain of wheat is gone, when the last unclean animal has been eaten, and the hunger becomes a physical monster, twisting their insides, screaming in their minds. It is at this moment that the unimaginable becomes possible. The ultimate taboo becomes a horrifying act of survival. This is the point of no return. This is where the curse spoken of in Leviticus and Deuteronomy becomes a ghastly, living nightmare. The most visceral and heartbreaking accounts of this horror come not from one, but from several sieges in the history of ancient Israel and Judea. One of the earliest and most chilling accounts is in the second book of Kings. During the siege of Samaria, King Jehoram of Israel was walking along the city wall when a woman cried out to him, begging for help. When the king asked what was wrong, she told him a story that made his blood run cold. She pointed to another woman and said, "This woman said to me, 'Give up your son so we may eat him today, and tomorrow we'll eat my son.' So we cooked my son and ate him. The next day I said to her, 'Give up your son so we may eat him,' but she has hidden him." Let the absolute horror of that sink in. This was not a random act of madness. This was a planned, rational agreement between two mothers. Their desperation was so complete, so absolute, that they had formalized the systematic consumption of their own children. The woman's complaint to the king was not one of grief or shame over what she had done, but of pure outrage at a broken contract. The moral fabric of their world hadn't just frayed, It had been utterly incinerated by hunger. Upon hearing this, the king tore his clothes in despair, the act of a ruler who had lost all control, whose kingdom had descended into a living hell. Centuries later, during the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, long after Herod's death, but a terrifying fulfillment of the same cycle of violence, the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus provides an even more detailed and stomach-churning account. Josephus was an eyewitness to the fall of Jerusalem, and his writings paint a hellish landscape of starvation. He wrote of men fighting over scraps of dung, of rebels bursting into homes and torturing people just to find a hidden crust of bread. And then he tells the story of Mary, the daughter of Eleazar. She was a woman of wealth from a good family who had fled to Jerusalem for safety. Inside the besieged city, rebels had stolen all her food and possessions. Famine, Josephus writes, pierced through her bowels and marrow. Driven to the edge of insanity by a hunger that admitted no passion but its own, she looked at her infant son, nursing at her breast. Josephus records her horrifying words as she speaks to her child. Poor little mite. In war, famine, and civil strife, for which of these should I preserve you? Come, then, be my food, a fury to these rebels, and a tale to the world, the one thing that was wanting to the calamities of the Jews. With those words, she killed her son. She then roasted his body, ate half, and hid the rest. Soon, the smell of cooking meat, a smell that hadn't been in the city for months, drifted from her house, attracting the rebels. They burst in, threatening to kill her if she didn't give them her food. With a ghastly look, Mary uncovered the remains of her child. "This is my own son," she said, "and my own work. Eat, for I have eaten. Do not be more tender than a woman, or more compassionate than a mother." Josephus records that the rebels, men hardened by war and brutality, fled from the house, seized with a horror so profound they were speechless. For the first time, he writes, they were afraid. The story spread through the dying city like a plague. Even the hardened Roman commander, Titus, upon hearing of it, swore an oath to bury this abomination under the ashes of the city. Mary's act became the ultimate symbol of Jerusalem's fall, a sign that all hope, all morality, all humanity had been extinguished. It was the final, monstrous catalyst for the brutal assault that destroyed the city and its holy temple. This was the final stage of starvation, not just a physical affliction, but a moral apocalypse. A state of being where a mother's love, the most powerful instinct in nature, was not just broken, but extinguished and replaced by the raw, animal need to survive. The events we're discussing are some of the most extreme in all of human history. They are difficult to confront, but vital to understand. The stories we tell here on History's Chronicles of Horror are humanity's darkest truths. If you believe it's important to face our past, no matter how terrifying, take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's the only way we can continue to bring these crucial, chilling stories out of the shadows. What happens after the hunger ends? When the siege is finally lifted, or the city falls, and food is once again available, what becomes of the people who survived? How does a society ever recover from a trauma so profound that it drove mothers to eat their own children? The physical scars of famine might heal, but the psychological wounds fester for generations. In the immediate aftermath, there is the grim, silent accounting. For Jerusalem in 70 AD, Josephus puts the number of dead from starvation and war at over 1 million people. The city was razed to the ground, its temple destroyed, its people scattered across the empire or sold into slavery. For those who survived, the memory of what they had seen, what they had endured, and what they had done was an inescapable ghost. The stories of the siege, and particularly the acts of cannibalism, were never forgotten. They were recorded and retold, burned into the collective memory of the Jewish people. These accounts, preserved by historians like Josephus and within the biblical texts, became a form of historical trauma. They were more than just chronicles of past events. They were dire warnings. They represented the lowest point to which their nation had ever fallen, a horrifying testament to the consequences of internal division and turning away from God. The story of Mary of Bethezuba, in particular, was used for centuries as a cautionary tale. For Josephus, it was the ultimate justification for Jerusalem's destruction, an act so foul it proved the city itself had become unholy. In later Christian traditions, The story was reinterpreted as a sign of divine punishment on the Jewish people for rejecting the Messiah. The raw, human desperation of the event was stripped away, and it was reframed as a theological point, a weapon in religious debates. But beyond all the politics and religion, there is a deeper, more terrifying human legacy. These stories force us to confront the shocking fragility of what we call civilization. They reveal that the rules, the morals, even the instincts we believe are unshakable, like a mother's love for her child, can be systematically broken down by the relentless pressure of starvation and fear. The survivors would have lived with this knowledge for the rest of their lives. How do you look your neighbor in the eye, knowing what they might have done to survive? How do you rebuild a community on a foundation of such horrific memories? The trust that holds a society together is shattered. The world is no longer a place of order and divine justice, but a place where the unspeakable is not only possible, but has already happened. The legacy of these events is a stark reminder that history is not just a collection of dates and kings. It is the story of human experience, in all its glory and all its horror. It shows that under the right combination of brutal leadership, war, and desperation, any society, anywhere, can be pushed over the edge into a nightmare from which it may never fully awaken. The Mad King may die, the siege may end, but the memory of the unthinkable choice remains. We began this journey with a Mad King and an unthinkable act. We have walked through the paranoid, blood-soaked court of Herod the Great, a ruler whose fear and cruelty created a kingdom ripe for disaster. We have felt the gnawing emptiness of famine, the slow, suffocating death of a city under siege. And we have stood at the precipice of human endurance, staring into the abyss of the ultimate taboo. The story of parents eating their children is not a myth made up to shock us. It is a documented, historical reality that erupted in times of extreme duress, from the siege of Samaria to the fall of Jerusalem. It represents the absolute zero point of human hope, where the fundamental laws of nature are overturned by the biological imperative to survive. The detailed accounts from Josephus and the Book of Kings are a terrifying window into the human soul when it is stripped bare. And what of the Mad King Herod? While history doesn't record this specific horror happening under his direct rule, his legacy is inextricably linked to it. A ruler's first duty is to protect their people. Herod did the opposite. His tyrannical reign, his crushing taxes, and his endless capacity for violence created the very conditions of fear and desperation where such nightmares could take root. He didn't light the final fire, but he spent 33 years piling up the kindling and drenching it in fuel. He was the architect of a society pushed so close to the edge that when the final crisis came, there was nowhere to fall but down. The true horror of this story is not just that it happened once, long ago. The horror is in understanding that the line between civilization and barbarism is perilously, terrifyingly thin. It's a reminder that our society is a fragile construct, easily broken by fear, by war, and by hunger. The story of ancient Judea is a timeless and chilling warning. It forces us to ask, how many missed meals, how many days behind a wall does it take to turn a human being into a monster? And when you look at the world around you today, how far away from that line do you think we really are? Thank you for joining us on this descent into history's chronicles of horror. If you believe these stories need to be told, please subscribe and share. Facing the darkness of our past is the only way to understand the world we live in today.